If you go to the end of the road, past Harper's house, on the left you will see a field with some old fruit trees in it. A little house used to be there, where a man called Morgan lived. He was a very quiet man who seemed to have enough money to live on. He didn't work on the farms, but he always went to town on market days. One day a young man came back from market with him. The young man was pale and thin, and he didn't speak very much. He lived with Mr. Morgan, and nobody knew if he helped with the housework or if Mr. Morgan was his teacher. But people talked and wondered why they were always walking together, early and late, up in the hills and down in the woods. They suspected that the two men were playing with magic and were plotting something terrible. Once a month, when the moon was full, they went up to a place on the hill where there are piles of old stones and rocks, and they stayed up there all night. Someone once asked Mr. Morgan why he went to such a dark, lonely place in the middle of the night. Mr. Morgan smiled and replied, "I love old places. They remind me of the past, and the air is beautiful on a summer's night. You can see all the countryside for miles around in the moonlight." But Mr. Morgan's young friend interrupted rudely. "We don't want other people near us. We just want to talk to each other." Mr. Morgan seemed annoyed at his young friend's rudeness, and he politely explained, "People say that there are bodies under those old stones, the bodies of dead soldiers. I know farmers sometimes find old bones in pots when they are working in the fields around here. I'd like to know more about how those people lived and who their gods were. I think they probably practiced magic." Then one morning in September, something terrible happened. A farm worker had to go up to the top of the hill, to the woods very early, when it was still dark. In the distance, he saw a shape that looked like a man in the early morning fog. As he came nearer, he saw that it was a man. It was Mr. Morgan's friend, dead, hanging from a tree. Near his feet was a knife covered in blood. The poor farm worker was terrified and ran back down the hill to the village. He woke up some of the villagers to tell them about the terrible sight, and some men went back up the hill with a horse to bring down the body. They also immediately sent a young boy to Mr. Morgan's house to see if he was at home, because of course they suspected that he was the murderer. When they cut down the young man's body from the tree, they were surprised to see the clothes he was wearing were all black, like the clothes that vicars used to wear many centuries ago. When the men's horse came near the tree and the dead young man, it screamed and tried to run away, but the men were able to hold it, and they finally got back to the village with the body across the terrified horse's back. In the village, they found the young boy standing in the main street with several women standing around him. He was as white as paper and would not say a word. When the men tried to move on towards Mr. Morgan's house, the horse again became very frightened. It stopped in the road and would not move. Then suddenly it turned and tried to run, and the body of the dead young man fell off its back onto the road. The horse could smell blood. They carried the young man's body to Mr. Morgan's house, and when they opened the door, they saw what the poor young boy had seen. There, on the long kitchen table, was the body of Mr. Morgan. Tied around his eyes was a black handkerchief, and his hands were tied behind his back. His chest was cut open from top to bottom, and his heart was gone. It was an awful sight. The men ran outside for some fresh air. The smell of death in that room was so terrible. Later, they put the young man's body next to Mr. Morgan's, and they looked carefully around the house. Why were these two men dead? How did they die? In one of the cupboards, they found a small green bottle of strong medicine, often used to put people to sleep. "I think that young man gave Mr. Morgan some of this stuff to put him to sleep," one man suggested, looking at the bottle, "and then killed him. Goodness knows why. Perhaps he needed Morgan's heart for his magic. Then later, perhaps, he was sorry about murdering his friend and went up the hill and killed himself." Well, the villagers decided that the two dead men could not lie in the graveyard near the church. They never came to church, and they didn't believe in God, they said. They believed in unnatural things, in magic. So 12 men covered the two bodies in black and took them to a place outside the village. There they dug a big hole, threw the bodies into it, and covered them with stones. People say that horses don't like going near that place even today, and there is a strange kind of light there. One day, sometime later, some people walking along the road found a pool of blood across it. In the blood, there were fat, black flies feeding. One man went to get some water, and they washed the blood away. but the flies flew up into the air like a dark cloud and flew towards Mr. Morgan's house. The villagers decided that no one should live in that house anymore, so they set fire to it. The house burnt down completely, but for a long time people said that they often saw Mr. Morgan and the young man standing at night when the moon was full in the road near the burnt house on the hill. Only the flies live there now. Perhaps it is only the flies who know why those two men played with magic and why they died the way they did. People used to say that it brought bad luck, that it was unlucky for fishing, said another man. Why? Asked Harris. But the people in the bar became silent and clearly didn't want to talk about the stone anymore. Harris was puzzled. A few days later, he decided to stay at home to study in the afternoon. He didn't feel like going out for a walk, but at about 3 o'clock he needed a break. He decided to spend 5 minutes looking at the other rooms on his floor of the house. He was interested to know what they were like. He got up and went quietly out of his room, into the corridor. Nobody else was at home. They are all probably at market today, he thought. The house was still and silent, except for the flies. The sun was shining and it was very hot. He went into the 3 rooms near his own bedroom. Each one was pretty and clean. Then he tried the door of the southwest room, but found that it was locked. This made Harris want to know why it was locked and what was inside it, and he took the keys of all the other doors on the floor to try to open it. He finally succeeded. The door opened, he went in and looked around him. The room had 2 windows looking south and west, so it was very bright and hot. There were no carpets and no pictures, only a bed, alone in the corner. It was not a very interesting room, but suddenly, Harris turned and ran out of the room, closing the door behind him noisily. Someone was in there, in the bed, he almost shouted. There were covers over the whole body on the bed, but it was not dead because it moved. He was not dreaming, Harris knew. This was the middle of a bright, sunny day after all. He didn't know what to do. First, of course, he had to lock the door again. But before he did this, he listened. Everything was silent inside the room. He put the key into the lock and turned it as quietly as he could, but he still made some noise. Suddenly, he stopped. Someone was walking towards the door. He turned and ran along the corridor to his room, closed the door, and locked it behind him as fast as he could. He waited and listened. Perhaps this person can walk through doors and walls, he whispered to himself. Nothing happened. Now what? He thought. His first idea was to leave the house as soon as he could, but if he changed his plans, Mr. and Mrs. Williams would know that something was wrong. Also, if they already knew about the person in the locked room, but they still lived in the house, then there was surely nothing for him to be afraid of. Maybe it would be better to stay and say nothing. This was the easiest thing to do. Harris stayed there for another week, and although he never went near the door again, he often stopped in the corridor and listened. But there was only silence. He didn't ask anyone in the village about the locked room because he was too afraid. But near the end of the week, he started to think more and more about the person in the locked room, and he eventually decided to find out more before he left. He made a plan. He would leave on the 4 o'clock train the next day, and while the horse waited outside with his bags, he would go upstairs and take one last, quick look into the room. This is what happened. He paid Mr. Williams, put the bags on the horse, thanked Mrs. Williams and said, "I'll just take a last look upstairs to be sure that I have all my things." He then ran up the stairs and opened the door to the room as quietly as possible. He almost laughed. "It's not a real person at all. How silly of me. It's just a pile of old clothes," he thought. He turned to go, but suddenly something moved behind him. He turned quickly and saw the pile of old clothes walking towards him, with a knife stuck into the front of its jacket and dried blood all down its shirt. He pulled open the door and rushed out of the room and down the stairs. Then he fell, and everything went black. When he opened his eyes, Mr. Williams was standing over him with a strong drink in a glass. He looked annoyed. "You shouldn't have done that, Mr. Harris, sir. It was a stupid thing to do after we've been so good to you. Why did you want to look in that room? Nobody will want to stay in this house anymore if you tell people what you've seen," he said. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to know, that's all," said Harris. "I won't tell anyone, I promise." So before he left, Mr. and Mrs. Williams told him what they knew. People say that a rich gentleman lived here a long time ago. One evening, he was out walking in the village when a group of men attacked him. They wanted to steal his money. They held him down on that big white stone, which you saw when you were out walking the other day, and they killed him with a knife. Then they threw his body into the sea. Later, some people from the village moved the stone away from the village. They said the fish along this part of the coast would not come anywhere near it. The fishermen were not catching anything, you see. The people who live in this house before us told us to lock that bedroom, but to leave the bed in it, because the gentleman's ghost might want to come back and sleep in the house again. You're the first person to see him since we've been here. He's never been a problem to us. But please don't tell anyone, they repeated. We don't want people talking about ghosts in this house. For many years, Harris didn't say a word to anyone about what happened in the Williams house in Dorset. And I only know his story because years later, when he came to stay with my family, I was the person who showed him to his bedroom. When we reached the bedroom door, he opened it very loudly and stopped outside. He stood there for a minute and carefully inspected every corner of the room before he went in. Then he remembered that I was standing there and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, my dear, but something very odd happened to me once." And he told me the story I have just told you. In October of the year 1833, a young boy arrived at the door of Blackwood Manor in the middle of Somerset. He rang the bell and looked around him at the tall, square 18th century house. The evening light fell on the building, making the windows shine like fires. In front of the manor, there was a park full of trees and a church with a clock. It all seemed very pleasant to the boy as he waited for someone to open the door. The boy's parents were deceased, and his elderly cousin, Mr. Carlyle, had invited him to live at Blackwood. People who knew Mr. Carlyle were surprised by his offer because they thought he was a man who loved books more than people and preferred to live alone. Mr. Carlyle opened the door, visibly pleased to see his young cousin, Nathaniel Emerson. He immediately started to ask questions. "How old are you, my boy? Are you well? And how old are you? I hope you're not too tired to eat supper." "No, thank you, sir," said Nathaniel. "I am quite well." "Good," said Mr. Carlyle. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed odd that he asked the question twice within their first few minutes together. "I'll be 12 years old next birthday," replied Nathaniel. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" 12th of October, eh? That's good. Very good. I like to write these things down. Are you sure you'll be 12? "Yes, sir, quite sure." "Well, take him to Mrs. Beckett's room, James," Mr. Carlyle said to his servant, "and let him have his supper." Mrs. Beckett was the friendliest person at Blackwood Manor, and Nathaniel quickly felt comfortable with her. They became good friends in just a quarter of an hour. She was 55 years old and knew everything about the house and the surrounding area. She was quite willing to share this information with Nathaniel, who was eager to learn about Blackwood Manor and its grounds. One chilly evening in November, Nathaniel sat by the fire in Mrs. Beckett's room, contemplating his new home. "Is Mr. Carlyle a good man?" he asked suddenly. "Good? My child," said Mrs. Beckett. "He's the kindest man I've ever known. Haven't I told you about the little boy he brought here 7 years ago? And the little girl 2 years after that?" "No, please tell me about them, Mrs. Beckett," Nathaniel replied. "Well," she began, "I don't remember much about the girl. Mr. Carlyle brought her home after a walk and told Mrs. Carter to take care of her. The poor child had no family. She stayed with us for about 3 weeks, then one morning she was gone. She left the house while everyone was asleep. Mr. Carlyle looked everywhere, but she never came back. She was a quiet child, but she helped me a lot, and I loved her dearly." "And the little boy?" asked Nathaniel. "Ah, poor lad," said Mrs. Beckett. "He arrived here one winter day, playing his flute, and Mr. Carlyle asked him lots of questions like, 'Where are you from? How old are you? Where's your family?' He was very kind to the boy, but the same thing happened. He disappeared. That night, Nathaniel had a strange dream. Near his room at the top of the house was an old bathroom, rarely used. The upper part of its door had glass so one could see the bathtub inside. In his dream, Nathaniel peered through the glass and saw a thin, dusty figure in the bath with a sad smile, hands pressed over its heart. As he watched, a terrible cry emerged from its lips, and the arms began to move. Nathaniel was extremely frightened and woke up suddenly. He found that he was actually standing on the cold floor near the bathroom. Bravely, he looked through the glass again to check if the figure was real. It wasn't. He returned to bed. When Mrs. Beckett and Mr. Carlyle heard about Nathaniel's experience, they were very interested. Mrs. Beckett put a new curtain over the bathroom door glass, while Mr. Carlyle said he would record Nathaniel's dream in his book. Just before spring, two more strange incidents occurred. The first was that Nathaniel had another uneasy night, and the next day he found Mrs. Beckett mending his nightshirt, clearly annoyed. "How did you tear this so badly?" she asked. Nathaniel looked and saw several cuts, a few inches long. "I don't remember," he said, "but they're just like the scratches on my bedroom door." Mrs. Beckett looked at him with her mouth open, then rushed upstairs to check. "Well," she said when she returned, "that's odd. Those scratches are too high for a dog, a cat, or even a rat to make. Don't say a word to Mr. Carlyle, but remember to lock your door tonight." "Oh, I always do," replied Nathaniel. The following evening, the second strange event took place. Mr. James, the servant, joined Mrs. Beckett and Nathaniel in her room. He rarely visited, and he seemed nervous. "Mr. Carlyle will have to get his own wine if he wants a drink at night," he muttered. "If I can't get it during the day, I won't go down there at all. There's something down there in the cellar. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's rats, but I don't think so, and I don't like it." "Don't talk like that," Mrs. Beckett replied. "You'll frighten young Nathaniel." James quickly noticed Nathaniel and said, "Oh, I was only joking, you know." But Nathaniel knew it wasn't a joke and grew anxious. He asked questions, but James refused to elaborate on the cellar noises. It was now October 13th, 1834, a strange, blustery day. Nathaniel stood in the garden, feeling as though the wind carried whispers from invisible figures around him. After lunch, Mr. Carlyle said, "Nathaniel, my boy, come to my library late tonight at 11. I want to show you something about your future. Don't tell Mrs. Beckett or anyone else. Just go to your room at the usual time." Nathaniel was thrilled at the thought of staying up late. He peered into the library on his way upstairs that evening, noting a silver cup filled with red wine and an ancient document with faded writing on the table. Around 10 o'clock, Nathaniel stood at his open bedroom window, gazing over the moonlit countryside. The wind had calmed, and suddenly he heard cries in the distance. The sounds grew louder, approaching the house, then abruptly stopped. Just as he was about to shut the window, he noticed two children under the trees, a boy and a girl. The girl reminded him of the one in his dream, and the sight of the boy filled him with dread. She stood smiling, hands over her heart, while the boy stretched his hands out helplessly. His nails were long and dirty, and on his chest was a large, dark hole. Nathaniel's hair stood on end. He heard their terrible cries again before they vanished. Though frightened, Nathaniel went to Mr. Carlyle's library. The door wouldn't open at first, and when he knocked, there was no reply. He heard Mr. Carlyle's voice. No, a cry. Then silence. Suddenly, the door opened. Mr. Carlyle sat in his chair, eyes wide with terror, a large hole on his left side exposing his heart. The silver cup remained untouched. A book lay open on the table, and Nathaniel read. Long ago, people discovered magic could let them control the world, fly, or even change shape. But to use such power, it was essential to remove the hearts of three youths under 21. First was Alice Black on October 13, 1813. The second was Luca Moretti on October 12, 1826. Tonight on October 13, 1834, my cousin Nathaniel Emerson will complete the ritual. Nathaniel left the room quietly. For years, people wondered about Mr. Carlyle's death. It must have been a wild animal that entered through the window, they speculated, but Nathaniel knew the truth.